Professor Jamie MacIntosh is Director of Programs at the Institute for Security and Resilience Studies at UCL. Before joining the Institute, he was the Chief of Research and Assessment at the Defence Academy of the UK and was previously worked as a research scientist at the Ministry of Defence. Now this bit you already have in your handout. What you haven't got is the other bit that I'm going to tell you now. As you can see, it's to do with security and resilience. And I simply wanted to point out his credentials on the resilience side as well. Because Jamie was in fact acting in an advisory role to cabinet ministers, and he was commissioned by the then cabinet secretary, now Lord Wilson of Dinton. And Jamie co-authored the concept of resilience to crisis for the UK government in the spring of 2001. So as you can see, his credentials are pretty strong on this. The respondent will be Orit Gal, who is a political economist specializing in the practical applications of complexity theories. And I'm really very pleased when Orit sort of speaks, because she really does have that experience in the application. Over the past decade, she has concentrated much of her work on issues of complexity in conflict environments and the intersection between economic development and security. On the conflict side, she has worked as a project director for the Economic Cooperation Foundation, where she participated in Track 2 negotiations vis-à-vis the Palestinians and developed policy recommendations on economic peace building and the potential role of international intervention. Now, I think they are both excellently qualified to tell us about security and resilience challenges. Thank you, Jamie.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First off, I should state that although I am remain a government official, I'm speaking in a personal capacity as an academic today. As a former soldier myself, and as somebody who's hung around with the military for far too long, I'm going to bombard you with loads of pretty coloured slides, so you can tune out to those. There should be some pretty pictures in that. The real essence, given what Greg asked me to do, was to come down to some of the issues of getting complexity-based thinking actually into policy, strategy, and doing things in government. So I'm going to take you through 4 examples of where that has happened, whereas, as was said earlier, there are wins and losses. And I think certainly if you're going to use complexity, you need to be very clear how we learn to score more wins than losses in introducing complexity in these environments. So in good military fashion, I have set an aim. So the aim is to, if I can get rid of the funny little thing in front of me here. Greg? There's an alarm clock. Apparently there's an alarm here. You're all to wake up at this point.
Sorry about that.
Great, thank you. So my aim here then is to discuss the challenges ahead in advancing the pragmatic use of complexity. And it very much builds on some of the issues that Bridget raised in the last session. In outline then, I'm going to introduce the concept of resilience to crises, what we mean by that, and then a fetching little word that if you Google only comes to our institute, that is irresilience. And what that means, it's not the same as vulnerability, it's not the same as threat, it's the inverse, and I'll explain what that means. I'll then go through diagnosing fitness on these 3 particular criteria: differentiating risk and uncertainty, understanding the composability of capabilities, and I'll explain what capabilities are, but the bottom line here is the capacity to innovate and how crucial that is on the economic front, policy front, strategy front. The 4 case studies, if you like, I'm going to take you through, and I've deliberately left that as acronyms, so it won't benefit from photography. Is the critical national infrastructure, where I worked on what is now luridly called cyberspace in the 1990s, developing capabilities. The creation of the Civil Contingency Secretariat, my first machinery of government change that I was personally responsible for. Secondly, the Iraqi National Security Council, where I went about every 2 to 3 months to help educate the Iraqi National Security Council in the in the orange zone. I went out 10 times to basically tutor and mentor the senior policy and decision takers in the thick of that campaign. And the splitting of the Home Office and the creation of the Office of Security and Counterterrorism. And some ways forward. What I want to do first off is essentially define what resilience is and crises are and try to stop us feeding irresilience. My first point is very much that bureaucracies have a strong tendency to confuse crises with catastrophes. If they bother to read the shorter English dictionary, it's a very short entry. It says exactly what it means. It is a decisive moment, a turning point for better or worse. Bureaucracies have an awful knack of dithering and turning crises into catastrophes, because bureaucracies don't like taking decisions, and they don't like action, and they don't do delivery. So the sooner we get back to the fundamental maths of understanding that decisive moments happen, the data is always incomplete and inconsistent, and decisions need to be taken, that is a fundamental starting point. Crises are not bad. They're plural, they're not aberrations. Our definition of resilience then moves on from the origins of the word and the engineering definition, and in pithy summary I'd say it is not about bouncing back to the status quo ante. For the mathematicians and the physicists in the room, we all know we can't reverse time, and equilibria are aberrations, not the norm. So the fundamental definition, and this is one of the themes that we've had throughout the discussion today, is this bridging of the two cultures, the arts, and the largely arts and the sciences. This definition tries to do that. The mathematicians in the room will understand what we're saying in terms of power and bodies, whether they have intent or not. The ecologists will understand what we mean by the word transformation, rather than just returning to the status quo ante. And the reason we have pretty words like flux of interaction and flow of events is that we are about realistic assumptions, not unrealistic assumptions. In a network world, disconnecting things and pretending that you can reverse time is not really helping decision takers. This is a classic approach to risk analysis. In some ways, it really complements the kind of problems with cost-benefit analysis that was described earlier by Bridget. So we have policy people, and one of the questions I'd like to ask the audience in the next part of the session is, what do we mean by policy? Who are these people, and why are they not adding any value? So from an intelligence, security and defense perspective, these decisions that we're after then break down into information requirements for threat and vulnerability. It then becomes very simple to map out. It's all the interrogatives. We're looking at capability, intent and opportunity. So that's what systems, in which configurations, where and when do they see opportunities, how do they sense, and who and how do they operate. Similarly with vulnerability, we're talking about weakness, exploitation and exposure. We then move on to an impact assessment, and this is where it aligns beautifully and without any planning with Bridget, because it comes down to a cost-benefit analysis. The cost-benefit analysis that's done is all about value, or less about value and more about loss. And for those of you in the room who understand behavioral economics, couching things in terms of loss aversity immediately skews the kind of decisions that you're going to take. If you're part of the military-industrial complex, this is when you start salivating, because now you can see countermeasures coming downstream, and it means that we're going to spend an awful lot of money buying some very expensive over-engineered kit that comes in late and doesn't quite do what it says on the tin. The reality, called contingencies, doesn't exist except in the Treasury's funding line called contingencies, which is heavily protected. So across all our spending silos, we do not consider the real world. We commit to spending down a silo and make sure that we've bought hard product that's generally labelled white elephant. That's what the standard approach to risk does. Where it leaves you is at a risk acceptance threshold. This is all the tame stuff, not the uncertainty, because of course the good orthodox economists have ruled out all that bad stuff called reality. And we're now left with a risk acceptance threshold, under which we're obliged to buy protective security measures, otherwise known in the mafia as a protection racket. which involve avoiding or countermeasures, reduction, mitigation, or transfer. Risk transfer, of course, is all about shoving it under the carpet and moving it around until nobody notices quite where it is. Bankers are very familiar with this. All of which is couched around neatly periodic decisions. The decisions come up when decision takers want to have them, or rather when policymakers would wish a decision taker to take them, not when events dictate. And crises are aberrations. Now, these kind of assumptions lead to, as I've already alluded to, in-service dates slip, costs overrun, readiness levels fail, self-deception grows, and white elephants become easy to outflank. It misses irresilience. Now, by irresilience, if I just stray into the maths for a second, by irresilience, we're talking about things like small world clusters and scale-free phenomena in networks, what Clausewitz might have called a center of gravity. If you can hit one of those and achieve a cascading effect or a runaway effect, you are striking at irresilience. You have got your threat to hit where somebody hurts. In networks, we have very few indicators and warnings for this. By indicators, I mean reliable indicators that stuff's going to happen, and warning being warning time in which you're going to do something, not just admire the fact the indicators have gone up. What immediate actions do you have ready, and how do we learn in the flux of events? I'll skip over integrated emergency management. The key point here in some ways was addressed by Chuck Perrow with normal accidents. What we tend to do with all of our methodologies without any address to complexity is to keep ourselves boxed in the bottom left-hand corner. And the more we do of that, the more connected systems get and the smaller that box gets. And we don't address the realities beyond it. I've only added to it by actually pointing out, as I've met Chuck several times at Stanford, he's very clear that his diagram, which was based on the 3 Mile Island disaster and simultaneous hits on a small portion of mission-critical code, he is very clear that was a closed system. An open system would force you to start looking at path-dependent temporal systems, non-ergodic systems, and non-stationary systems. Big words that actually just mean reality. This all sounds a bit gloomy. What I also want to point out is risks and indeed uncertainties can be good and bad. And the whole essence of resilience, as we were trying to move this approach to resilience forward, was to understand that we needed to be, yes, more aware of evolving and emerging dangers, which tended to get ignored by classical risk analysis, and experimenting for possible gains. We need to be able to get at the upside too. Transformation, entrepreneurship are good as well as bad. So resilience is about evolving and learning, not just selecting what are incredible thoroughbreds until they finally fall over. At ISRS, we have a simpler approach in assessing resilience to crises. We do it for all sorts of organizations, and it focuses on their competencies for distributed decision-taking, their capabilities for immediate actions, and their capacity for innovation. We identify investment options, not just costs, and we're there to catalyze pragmatic actions, largely by bringing the public, private, and academia together. I want to quickly go through the fitness issues on decision-taking. For those of you who are familiar with the military, we talk about something called the OODA loop, Observe, Orientate, Decide, Act. Now, I happen to have met the guy who coined the phrase, John Boyd. When John Boyd talked about the OODA loop, he did not mean it as the bureaucrats think it. You start with observation and you might get round to a decision in an eon. He had a MiG-25 up his backside. What he did was he acted, and he might have time to learn. But you put the OODA loop into a bureaucracy, and all you get is a load of uniform cycles of observers doing very, very little, but passing paper. Meantime, our adversaries, using the networks that Futurist is putting together for them, are acting and experimenting. So we have to get beyond the strict rationalists and learn to be empiricists again ourselves. Let me quickly show you why that's important. This is an intelligence-based model. I mean, big intelligence, spooky intelligence. Our approach to threat, let's start with errors. So just like any science problem, we have to contend with false positives, false negatives, and warning times for fast and slow onset events. You've got to look at this plurality of temporal things. It's not just fast. And type 3 errors, which I take to be you've used the wrong methods. So what you find is heavy investment in the threat side of things can lead to self-deception. You're going to believe that satellite and the glossy image it's giving you because it costs a lot of money to put it up there. And we're not going to believe the scrap of paper we're getting from human. The passive collection of leaked data is a weak approach to the threat. Plus, they know you're coming. Increasingly in the environment in which we operate, particularly in the cyber world, it is easy to do concealment and decoys. So often when those of you who have been victims of spear phishing, they're profiling what you're doing and they're suckering you for picking up on a profile and repeating it. So they use it to dazzle you in one direction and then come at you from a different direction. The capacity for concealment, decoys, and deception is improving. So threats can be held virtual and defy profiling. Retaliation for passive or active measures is increasing. That means whereas before people like the Iranians or the Venezuelans could get pretty upset about geostationary satellites parked over their airspace, they now might actually have the means to do something about it through software. And vulnerability-led responses pander to security bandits. They'll come along and play up your paranoia and keep telling you to do stuff that costs you lots of money, gums up your systems, and doesn't actually achieve anything. So we need portfolios of options that are dynamic. And that simple dyad of interaction in an intelligence model shows you how dynamic and fluid risk and uncertainty with events actually is. Just to underscore that point, what I'd call net assessment goes to macro and micro. It is not just a Cold War situation of red and blue, of the Soviets versus NATO. It is a multi-level of actors who may be state and non-state, they may be macro, they may be micro. They may not even intend to do you any harm. Just defining capabilities, so we're clear about that. Sid Winters, the author of Evolutionary Economics, defines capabilities as routines that confer decision options. His academic sparring partner, David Teese, defines it as the capabilities to acquire capabilities. We've moved it on slightly by saying capabilities are evolving ecologies of competencies and technology. Now this is the point that it took Christensen 5 years to figure out. Initially he thought it was all about disruptive technology. Then he realized, no, disruptive innovation was all about the social stuff. And if you don't get the social stuff to work, you don't get the innovation to happen. I'll gloss over the composability point at the moment, but composability is not the same as integration. Things are alive, they keep moving. Just the intellectual property issues of putting together different models and different data sets show this is a different level of abstraction from just integration, and it's a hard maths problem. Tractability, again, is about how much ground can you gain in sufficient time. I want to try and move towards an optimistic note. When we devised the concept of resilience to crisis, we kept saying the risks can be good. And unlike the orthodox economists, we understood from the defense and security world that it wasn't all about diminishing returns and everything being rival risk and consumption. I'm not saying you can wish that away, but there are, with the capacity to innovate that we have, increasing potential for non-rival risk and consumption and things that work with the law of increasing returns. The trouble is, in the public sector and public services, nobody quite knows how to lead and deliver that kind of innovation. They are not selected, trained, or advanced for their capacity to be entrepreneurs. Quite the reverse. What I've said here is essentially, if we go through the business literature, it is about explore and exploit, not exploit or explore. It's both. You can use people like Andrew Lowe's adaptive market hypothesis. I wouldn't be so keen on Amartya Sen's capabilities approach. It's not the same kind of realist thing we're talking about here. And certainly, if you look at new institutional economics, the grounds for non-ergodic and non-stationary approaches to economics have been well laid. And this is important, given where we're trying to get to through the current financial crises. You'll notice the House of Lords issued a report earlier this week where they finally understood that economics is a national security issue. If we achieve these kind of things, we can get over the innovation bottleneck and into a wider ecosystem. How many of you in this room know how many scientific papers are published, peer-reviewed, every day on this planet? 9,000. And most of that is jammed at the academic end of invention. If we could open that bottleneck just 1 to 2%, imagine the challenges we could address. And that's what we're trying to set up here. Let me give you very quickly in closing then a couple of examples of where, sorry if I'll just go back a second bit. Forget your Machiavelli at your peril. Let me summarize that for you rather than give you the quote. Machiavelli advocates bold leadership. His bottom line though is, don't get caught. Anybody who subscribes to complexity is advocating something that is going to disrupt an awful lot of vested interests, and they will screw you up. I'm now going to go through some examples. Critical national infrastructure is very much a global and local network. You cannot put overlays on the United Kingdom and assume that you've understood how to protect the critical national infrastructure. Our critical national infrastructure is global and dynamic. BT switches may well be, for loading purposes, parked somewhere over Tahiti. By the time we've got the territorial army ready to go and defend them, it's moved to Moscow. There are real dynamics in this point. We developed a modeling system under a program of synthetic environments called SMUTS, Synthetic Modeling of Uncertainty in Temporal Systems, because General SMUTS had managed to get a complexity-based relationship with policy over 50 years ago. And it's that kind of basis, and of course, Richardson is another one who kind of got this kind of point ages ago as well. What we were addressing in particular with the critical national infrastructure was this issue of competitiveness. If you're trying to get the private sector to buy stuff, don't try and get them to do it as an insurance premium. Don't try and get them to buy countermeasures. Get them to understand this is about their competitiveness. And we got quite far with that. The major problem is the usability. When we developed this for for the Civil Contingency Secretariat, the biggest danger we spotted in June 2001 was financial stability, not terrorism or cyber. Bringing together all of the officials became a real problem and giving them the kind of functions and competencies that we needed. We did not develop a doctrine. The whole idea was to distribute decision-taking. Instead, we put together the Civil Contingencies Act. With the Iraqi National Security Council, what we did was we introduced complexity using event-driven scenarios. I say event-driven scenarios, not scenarios. We deliberately put up patterns of decisions and asked them what they were going to do and how they would learn. And as we did that with them in real-time events, they began to draw on complexity models just quite naturally, organically. It supported them in campaigns and strategies. And finally, with the Office of Security and Counterterrorism, we dealt with leadership issues both in political class, the accountability for who was driving counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and most importantly, involved practitioners, the chiefs, not the policymakers, by which I mean the chiefs of police, the chiefs of intelligence, the chiefs of military, and most importantly, the chief scientific advisors. Now, if you can imagine a proto-National Security Council with 25 seats around the table, 4 or 5 of those occupied by ministers, then the chiefs, how many secretaries did we actually need? 3. That was how many secretaries we needed. That caused a lot of upset. So if we look at the National Security Council and the establishment of the National Security Council official, you can see the priests are fighting back. They want the chiefs out, they want the doers out, and they want to put the policymakers back in. But it is not clear that they are actually adding any value, as we saw with Libya. At that point, I'll draw.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.